Donald Trump's launching of America into Israel's war with Iran is the biggest foreign policy gamble of his presidency. He heralded Sunday morning's airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites as spectacularly successful. Iran threatened retaliation, and tonight Qatari air defences intercepted Iranian missiles targeting a US military base. To reflect on the international crisis, we're joined live from Washington by Amy Mackinnon, a reporter specialising in national security and intelligence. In Amsterdam is Dr Siavush Randjbar-Daemi from St Andrews University's Institute of Iranian Studies. And here in the studio we have Glasgow University's Chair of Global Security, Professor Peter Jackson. Thanks all for coming into Scotland tonight. Now, it seems that the US and Qatar were given notice of Iran's retaliatory attacks tonight. President Trump described it as a very weak response. Of the 14 missiles fired, 13 were knocked down, and he says he hopes Iran has gotten it all out of their system. Amy, was all this completely prearranged?
I don't know if I would say it was rearranged, but the US was certainly given a heads up that Iran was going to respond in some form today in the wake of the US strikes on its nuclear facilities over the weekend. As Trump said in that message, the Iran telegraphed ahead of time their planned strikes on a US airbase in Qatar, which gave the US a heads up and chance to get its personnel and its assets out of the way. Now, this is being interpreted as an effort by the regime in Tehran to take a bit of an off-ramp and to de-escalate. It gives them the ability to tell their audience at home that they have responded, they've attacked US troops, and it gives them something to sell domestically to the public and to try and look strong in the wake of these attacks without provoking the US and getting into a escalatory cycle of tit-for-tat further strikes.
Siavush, is that how it will be taken in Iran?
Well, the population are very wary in Iran, and the problem is that in the next few days, Israel has already promised to carry on its pounding of Tehran that we've seen today in particular. So I'm not really sure that this will have a really morale-boosting effect if you put it in the context of what's happening. That was just one stealth American strike on those 3 nuclear installations. Today alone, Israel claimed to have dropped 100 bombs all over Tehran and intends to do it again in the next few days. So I think, again, the crux of this confrontation is between Iran and Israel rather than between Iran and the United States. Maybe that chapter is gone, but the conflict remains between Iran and Israel.
So, Peter, are we almost being sidetracked by what seems to be some kind of performative retaliation tonight?
Well, I think that there was an element of kind of performative politics on the part of Iran, indicating that it was what it was more or less going to do. It's also interesting that Iran and Qatar are more or less friendly states, and I think it was interesting that they chose Qatar as the kind of the location to focus Iranian retaliation. But it is interesting also that the attacks that killed the Iranian Republican Guard leader Suleiman were also launched from Central Command in Qatar, and therefore I think that was one of the kind of logics of the target.
Amy, just sticking with the US for a moment, is this the end of the engagement from the US, do you think, in military terms?
Well, Trump met with his national security team at 1 o'clock this afternoon, where as these strikes on Al Udeid Air Base were happening, and they were there discussing how to handle this crisis and how to take things forward. I mean, if this, as Peter said, repeats the pattern we saw in 2020 with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani by the Trump administration, which was seen as a major escalation against Iran, then the regime opted to take a bit of an off-ramp, again with a limited response against US troops. It seems like that similar pattern may be playing out now. But one thing that experts always remind me about Iran is that it has a very long memory, and it may still opt to respond asymmetrically, so not with a direct military attack against US troops and forces in the region, but perhaps by assassination attempts, by terror attacks somewhere against US interests, anywhere in the world outside of the Middle East. After the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Iran attempted to pursue assassination attempts against several US officials, including Trump, who made that decision. They weren't successful, but they do have a history of this. And so I think there is a potential that that kind of realm could play out for months and even perhaps years to come.
Peter, that's clearly what you're expecting from this. You're nodding vigorously at that.
Well, I don't think we should rule it out as a possibility. It would be very premature to do that. I mean, Iran has a number of options to choose from. It could launch cyber attacks, for example. It could encourage terrorism assassination attempts. It could even put pressure on the global economy by closing or threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz.
But that would damage themselves economically, wouldn't it, Siavush? What do you expect to be the outcome from the Iranian side? Do you expect them even to go back to talks?
Well, not at the moment, no. In order for talks to occur, there has to be some end to the Israeli bombing campaign. The Iranians have made it clear, and now they were willing to talk to Americans before they bombed, provided the Israelis stop bombing. So now they have maybe they've settled the score with the Americans, but the Israeli bombing remains there. And Israel claims that it's very, very close from hitting its targets. It could do a mission accomplished and stop bombing, and maybe that would create an opportunity. But there doesn't seem to be at the moment the possibility of a mediated end to this bombing. Some mediator or third party stepping in and brokering a ceasefire. At the moment, both sides are digging in and shooting things at each other, as they've done since the previous Friday.
So where does all this leave the Israel-Iran conflict then? Siavush?
Well, it's still simmering. I mean, Israel keeps having this military and intelligence advantage. It keeps pounding targets in Iran, but it's not really bringing about the sort of regime change that Netanyahu has called for, and also some Iranian exiles like the former crown prince close to Israel have called for. I see still no signs of an uprising from the people. And of course, an aerial bombardment alone cannot bring the regime down. There either has to be some form of a popular uprising or a continuous set of assassinations. At the moment, it's slim. I don't think Iranian people are buying into regime change. They know what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, two neighboring countries, when regime change was imposed from the outside. There seems to be a sentiment of patriotism emerging, which is not necessarily support for the Islamic Republic, but it's more rallying around the flag. Notwithstanding the severe amounts of discontent and disenchantment with the Islamic Republic, which were there prior to the start of the bombing and which will resume probably after this military campaign comes to an end, because of course the underlying problems that Iran faced, for example, the severe economic situation that got them into negotiating it with America in the first place, will be exacerbated by all this. So the Iranian people stand out to lose very badly, whatever the outcome of this conflict is. And that, of course, could persuade them to continue their dissent and their confrontation from anything from the veil to relations with the West to the economy.
Amy, is regime change what the US, what President Trump wants? He's hinted at it, certainly.
Well, Trump says one thing and then he says another. I mean, his top officials yesterday, after the strikes overnight on Saturday, were out saying we do not want regime change, very clearly trying to message that. But as you said, Trump has kind of flirted with the idea. And there are hawkish voices in the Republican Party, such as Lindsey Graham, a very prominent senator who's close to Trump, who has hinted more forcefully at this. But I think they are aware that that's the kind of thing that the Iranian regime would see as potentially an existential threat if they did feel that the US was backing regime change, and could prompt a very fierce response from Iran. I've had former intelligence officers describe that to me as a kind of a gloves-off moment for Iran.
Peter, do you see a strategy from the US on this?
Well, it's very difficult to know with Donald Trump whether he's planned, whether he has a vision of what constitutes an end game and a successful result. He has flirted, as Amy has just said, with the idea of regime change, and this will be very divisive within his own movement, but also within Congress and the American population as well. One thing we definitely know about American public opinion is it doesn't support war with Iran.
Briefly, Amy, what comes next from the US point of view on this?
Well, I think as has been alluded to, I mean, somewhat depends on how Israel continues with its campaign against Iran. I think, my expectation is that the US is probably going to back down now that we've seen a more muted response from Iran. But if Israel keeps striking Iran and Iran keeps responding against Israel, if some of those missiles get through and cause serious damage in Israel, does the US feel compelled to come and defend it more directly? And does that send mixed messages to Iran, which sees the US and Israel closely aligned, which they are in the region? Do they then respond against US assets? So I think that's going to shape a lot in the weeks to come.
Thank you all for joining us in Scotland tonight. There is more of this to come, undoubtedly.